We are growing in our understanding of the grace of God with best-selling author, pastor, and communicator Andy Stanley, the founder of North Point Ministries with 5 campuses in Atlanta, Georgia. More than 25,000 people join one of those congregations each Sunday to hear your message, Andy, or do they have their own pastor?
Each of our campuses has a campus pastor, but we disperse our teaching from one location. So I preach about 60% of the time.
So you're on video?
On video 60% of the time, and then our campus pastors preach the other time. And then we have a group of communicators that travel around within the city to those churches. So we mix it up.
Wow, but you are some busy man.
I'm busy, but you know, I'm at a stage of life where I'm really enjoying coaching and mentoring our young communicators, and we've got some men and women on staff that are extraordinary. Their names will be known, and I will be happy to have known that I had a small part in launching them. So we're very blessed in that regard.
Fabulous. Was I wrong to say congregation?
No, that's...
I mean, everything you do is a little different.
Yeah, we don't know how to use those terms either, honestly. Nobody even knows what to call me. I'm not the senior pastor anymore, so we've sort of outgrown the labels.
You're not the senior pastor.
Well, because I'm not located on a specific campus anymore. So some people people have suggested bishop. And I said, no, I'm not going to be the bishop, and my wife isn't going to be the bishopess. So I don't really have a label right now.
Man at large, pastor at large.
I don't know.
Very large. Well, someone said, grace is unmerited favor to one deserving positive disfavor. Were you with us last segment? Rahab was a very good example of that. Rahab the prostitute. But from a really raunchy lifestyle to a member of the royal family of Messiah. Beautiful story. Today, a very different example. King David, the man who had everything, behaved very badly.
The man who knew better.
He did.
In fact, the reason this is such an important story in the story of grace is because he knew better. Now, he not only knew chapter and verse, he wrote some of...
He wrote the ones we live by.
Right, he wrote some of the chapter and verse, the songs that we sing. And you know, this is the story that I think reflects maybe my story, not because of my behavior, but because I grew up in a pastor's home, and consequently, whenever I sinned, I always knew. I was never ignorant. You know, I knew the chapter and the verse, I knew the story, I knew the illustration. I always knew better. And
You're probably waiting for the lightning bolt every
Exactly.
time.
And I think some of us who grow up in church and know better, we think, well, maybe we've moved outside of grace. Maybe we've moved beyond grace. The person who didn't know any better, I can understand God extending grace to them. They didn't know any better. But what about those of us who knew better,
willful sin,
who know better, and did it anyway? And the story of David is a story where we see God's grace extended to someone who knew better.
Here's the other problem with David. And it was an unbeliever who just last week, she knows enough of the stories in the Bible. She said, wasn't David the one that they call the man after God's own heart?
Right.
Didn't he, and I knew exactly where she was going to go, murder? Adultery?
Yeah.
And, you know, here's someone without the whole story, not really knowing God yet, and it's not a match.
Right.
Man after God's own heart, murder and adultery. On the grace side, on the salvation side, if you would. So, yeah, what would you have said?
Well, that's a great observation. How could someone who is a man after God's own heart do all those things and still be a part of the story and not...
he didn't lose his title.
Right. And again, we see at the end, he is in the lineage of Jesus the Messiah, who was born in the city of David, who was a part of the lineage of David.
So the Scripture's still honoring him.
Because that's grace. And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted people to understand grace is not a New Testament thing. Grace is not an exception to the rule. Grace isn't something God came up with later because, you know, nothing else was working. Grace began in the Garden of Eden, and grace has been a part of this story every single step of the way. And all of us who need grace can find ourselves in these stories. And so whereas Rahab the prostitute or Rahab the harlot didn't know any better and God extended grace, King David knew better and God extended him grace as well. God gave him exactly what he did not deserve. And that's our story.
Our guest counselor recently made this profound statement. The enemy builds strongholds in secrecy and enforces them by silence.
Right.
In the Psalms, David talks about how he suffered when he kept his sin with Bathsheba a secret.
I tell people all the time, the worst thing you can do is keep secrets. Secrets grow, they grow in their power, and they drive us into behaviors that we would not normally move toward. It's like picking up a rock in the backyard and looking at what's underneath. Nobody wants to do that because it's ugly and gross. But the only way to get rid of some of those bugs is to expose them to light. And so as people carry secrets, like David tried to carry this secret, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse.
It affected his physical health, not just his emotional
It affected
being.
his family, it affected his reputation, it affected everything. But in spite of that, what do we find? Grace. He suffered the consequences, and that's another big topic. Does grace erase?
We don't want to gloss over that.
Yeah, grace does not erase consequences, but grace at the same time means that you can remain in a relationship, a real relationship with the God that you have sinned against in spite of your sin. That's grace.
Interesting that David would say in Psalm 90, verse 8, "You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence." Nothing's hidden from God.
Right, God knows.
I don't know if David realized that in all those months when he was hiding.
I think David did what we all do. He sinned and he tried to cover, then he tried to cover the cover, and then he tried to cover the cover of the cover. And eventually it all came out, and it was a total disaster, total disaster. But in the midst of that, God did not break his promise to David, God did not abandon David, and God fulfilled his promise to David that he would always have an heir on the throne.
Yeah. Bathsheba's first baby, their baby conceived in sin, died.
Right.
And I love that you say, you know, you take the part of Joe Average looking at this story. What would Hollywood do with it, for example? Bathsheba would be barren. That would be it.
Right.
That would be her consequence.
Right.
Or she'd be driven to self-destruction.
Right.
In remorse and grief and loss.
Instead,
tell it.
Instead, her next son is the wisest man who ever lived.
The wisest, the wealthiest,
right.
the king of the golden era
of Israel,
for Israel,
that's right.
And the author of 3 books of our Bible.
And part of the lineage through which the Messiah came. We wouldn't have written the story that way.
No.
Why would God choose to do that? And it makes me believe these stories are historical. No one would have written the story that way. In fact, the moral of that story isn't even a good moral. Sin and it'll all work out. Really? Is that the story you want to tell your children? But God chose to exhibit his amazing grace. Within the midst of sin committed by a man who knew better. And I think that helps all of us.
Samuel Rutherford said, "Millions of hells of sinners cannot come near to exhaust the infinite grace of God." This is just a good example. And here's our takeaway. The grace of God has no load limits.
Right.
As you said, Andy, the ultimate promise keeper to one of history's greatest promise breakers. Seen in this story.
I wrote this: if grace had limits, David's behavior would have exposed them.
It doesn't get much worse.
Right. If grace had limits, if there was ever a point where God says, "That's all of that I can take. That's it. I'm breaking my promises. I'm walking away." David's behavior, because of all he'd been given, all he had been promised, all he had seen, all he'd experienced, David tested God's load limits, and there are no limits.
A little P.S. Andy has already alluded to the fact that there were consequences. When you read the rest of the story of David's daddyhood and family life,
it's not pretty.
It's not pretty. I believe because of his behavior, he felt he didn't have the authority to discipline his sons when they behaved badly.
Right, and he did. He lost his moral authority.
There you go.
And when you lose your moral authority, you tend to step back instead of stepping in. And because of that, his family was a complete wreck. And yet it was his family that God chose
to keep working with.
Right.
And poor Uriah. Boy, our hearts go out to that honorable man who wouldn't even spend the night with his wife when the army was still out there. And so David couldn't make that little situation work.
Right.
And he was sent to the front lines where, in David's plan and purpose, he was murdered, taken out. He is honored in the genealogy of Messiah in Matthew.
Right.
It says Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah.
Yep.
So God doesn't miss anything.
Nope. And here we are, many, many, many thousands of years later, talking about Uriah. And even though in the moment you think, oh, Uriah got the short end of the stick, he really lost it. Where's God's grace in his life? God's grace in his life is he was the hero of the story, and he is legendary thousands of years later.
Forever
and ever. Right.
Oh, man, you think the Bible's boring? You need to read it again. We sing it. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. As Andy says in his book, undeserved, unmerited, unexpected, unexplainable, unbelievable grace. Do you want to learn more about what Jesus died to give you? The grace of God is our thanks to you this month for your support, keeping us strong for the month of August. We do want to hear from you. Here's the information you need.